For anyone joining us for the first time, we've been going for about 4 years maybe, in the book of Acts. Slow progress, but it's been an amazing book to kind of shape us as a church, I think, in the last few years. To let you know, in the run-up to Easter, there is going to be a different series over Easter, and then following Easter, we're going to be doing our Meet Jesus series again, where we meet Jesus in the stories about him in the Gospels, hopefully for all of us to enjoy seeing Jesus in the Gospels again, but also hopefully for people who come to Easter and want to find out more about the Christian faith, no better place to start than in the Gospels. So that's kind of the logic, is following on from Easter, we will be in the Meet Jesus series, and we'll be finishing in Acts. So these two chapters, chapter 14, 15, are going to bring us to an end of our series in Acts for this year, and then probably, almost certainly next year, we will pick up again in the book of Acts. So that's giving you a bit of time to find your place. We're starting Acts chapter 14, verse 5. When an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and stone them, just for context, two characters, Paul and Barnabas, are in the town of Iconium, and they have been preaching, declaring the word of God, and there's been quite a lot of chaos, division, some people going with them, some people turning very strongly against them, and this is where we are at the moment. So there was a plan emerged. They found out, I don't know how they found out, whispers, rumors, that there was a plan to stone them, probably in the public square. So they found out about it, verse 5, and they fled to the Lycaonian towns of Lystra and Derbe. These are sort of hilltop towns, very, very Gentile. Gentile means not Jewish. This would have been a very alien countryside, an alien place for someone like Paul and Barnabas to go, and to the surrounding countryside. And there they continued preaching the gospel. So that's sort of a broad statement of what was going on. Now, verse 8, we sort of zoom in. In Lystra, a man was sitting who was without strength in his feet, had never walked, and had been lame from birth. If you want to do a bit of homework, go back to Acts chapter 3, and you will notice very, very similar story. There was a man lame from birth sat outside the temple in Jerusalem, and Peter heals him in a very similar way, just proving that Jesus is as active as he was in Jerusalem. He is that active in a small backwards town called Lystra in the hilltops, very, very far from Jerusalem. Jesus is the Lord of all the nations. So there's this man, he's been lame from birth. Verse 9, he listened as Paul spoke. After looking directly at him and seeing that he had faith to be healed, Paul said in a loud voice, "Stand up on your feet." And he jumped up and began to walk around. If you know any of the prophets of the Old Testament, there's this prophecy that in the age of the Messiah, the lame will dance and run and gallop like deer. And this is a very poetic description of this man jumping up and beginning to walk around. The prophecies are coming true about this messianic age. Verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, this would have been very discombobulating for someone like Paul, suddenly hearing them breaking out in their local languages. The gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought bulls and wreaths to the gates because he intended with the crowds to offer sacrifices. You can imagine that moment, the clip-clop of hooves. Paul's been preaching, hoping that they will understand what he's saying, and then there's this clip-clop of hooves up the path as two enormous bulls are being led up into their presence, and they're thinking, what on earth? What are they thinking? Are they flattered? Are they terrified? Are they repulsed? Are they frustrated? Verse 14, the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd shouting, "People, why are you doing these things? We are people also, just like you, and we are proclaiming good news to you," the gospel, "that you turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, and filling you with food and your hearts with joy." Even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them. If you've ever done preaching or anything like that, it is amazing how you feel like you've communicated clearly and then hardly anything seems to have sunk in. And then verse 19, it gets even worse. Some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, so these were the towns that Paul and Barnabas had just come from. And when they won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, thinking he was dead. I'm going to leave the cliffhanger there to pick up next week. A storm had been brewing across the region. Rumbles of thunder as Paul and Barnabas have spoken and preached in Antioch. And it went well at first, but then there was division and chaos. Then they leave and go to Iconium again. They see some success, but also some real catastrophic things. The thunder's getting louder and the threat of being stoned is very present. They escape. And then here in Lystra, you can almost imagine them thinking, we're probably safe here. It was the Jews that were stirring up. Surely they wouldn't come this far. And then lightning strikes. And there they are. Thank you for the sound effect. Lightning strikes. And he is stoned, and everyone around him thinks that Paul is dead in the dirt. He's just raised a man from the dust, a lame man, and now Paul himself is lying in the dust, face down, bleeding from his head. Luke is telling this story in quite a dramatic fashion to get you to be thinking about all sorts of things. But Luke is quite a clever storyteller if you're really tracking with it, because it's not quite the same as there's a lot of American TV dramas where every episode is kind of tied up neatly, that's the word, in a bow. There's no gaps. Sort of you understand the story by watching every episode. Obviously, there are a few threads going through, but really every episode is complete in itself. That's not the case with Luke. There are all sorts of holes and gaps in this story. Things that he hasn't told you that you might want to find out more about. Well, the point of that is so that you go and read further, read backwards, read forwards. I'll give you an example. What was Paul preaching so convincingly to this crowd that lame man believed it so much that Paul then saw his faith and said, actually, you can be healed? Also, did anyone else believe other than this lame man? It doesn't look like it from how Luke has told the story at this point. It seems like everyone turned on him apart from this one lame man who's skipping around happy. I think the biggest one that I'm wondering is, what was it that the Jews who came from Antioch and Iconium, what was it that they told the crowds to get them to turn so dramatically against Paul and Barnabas, to turn from worshipping them as gods to attempted murder and trying to get rid of them? What might the Jews have said to them? You discover by the end of the book of Acts that the rumor that had been spread about Paul particularly was that he was destroying societies. The word that's used to describe him is he was a plague on society. See, the Jews coming from Antioch and Iconium almost certainly weren't going in and saying, look, we're going to argue from Scripture against what he's saying. They almost certainly weren't trying to convert this crowd to Judaism suddenly. They could have done that any time, but they didn't. Almost certainly what they're doing are weaving together stories to destroy this man's reputation and make the crowd believe that he is actually a danger to society. They probably would have told that when he comes into our synagogues, he divides the synagogues. When he preaches to the town folk and to the Gentiles, he's causing many of them to deny their family traditions. He's ruining our societies. He's splitting our towns apart. He's causing enmity and anger against people. He's leaving the place in utter disarray, and he's just moving on to the next place. You've seen him heal someone, fair enough, but lots of the bad forces out there can heal people. You can imagine them trying to smear him with this kind of reputation, so that what you get, the town completely turn against this guy and stone him to death. And that sort of tactic of twisting a story to destroy a reputation and to destroy credibility has not stopped. It is carried on. This weaving together of threads into such a tight weave that it looks like it's one thing has not stopped. I'll give you an example. I went over to the National Maritime Museum about last year. It's over in Greenwich. Could we have the photo up? The photos of... Is there anyone there? Jermaine, you up? Brilliant. So over at the Greenwich Museum, currently I think this exhibit is there. Brilliant museum. I'm going to throw in all the caveats. Wonderful museum, amazing space, so much hard work, incredible artifacts that they've got on display. But we went into one of the main galleries called the Pacific Encounters. And the bit that piqued my interest was particularly a section called Faith and Mission. And maybe what I noticed immediately was faith and mission, as you can see in the picture. Faith and mission came under a bigger heading, which was exploitation. So that raised my eyebrows immediately to say, I wonder what's going to be said here. Then you read the description next to it. In the late 1700s, European missionaries began to travel to the Pacific, seeking to convert the islanders to Christianity. The arrival of Christianity introduced some positive changes, but it also destroyed traditional ways of life. Just the use of language is interesting. Some positives, destroyed. Missionaries confiscated objects and tried to suppress practices like tattooing, which they thought were at odds with Christian values. And then if you watch the video that's next to this sort of introductory board, some of the quotes from the video. Missionaries are seen as having brought peace and also salvation, but they also destroyed some of our cultural beliefs. And then one of the next quotations, I think, led with Christian mission was one of the most straightforward colonization tools. It's a way of converting people from one thing to another. And then colonization was about trying to replace some of the cultural practices. Now, please hear me. What I am not trying to do at this point is to defend European colonizers. I do not know the history of the events at all well. And also I have a huge amount of skepticism of lots of things that have been done in the name of Christianity. What I want to point out is how easily, I'd say, and maybe purposefully, I don't know, two threads that are not the same have been woven together. If you think about it, that title, Faith and Mission, placing it under a larger title of exploitation, immediately sets the scene. In the videos, interchangeably using the word Christianity with colonization, as if they are the same thing. And then finally, at the end, there is no attempt whatsoever to try and delineate and clarify how hypocritical the actions of these colonizers were compared to the Bible that they claim to believe. How so many of their actions go completely against what the Bible would teach about how to treat people and how to love and serve. There's no effort in that gallery at all to distinguish that and point out that actually, yes, they were claiming to be Christians, but they were incredibly hypocritical when they were doing so. But actually, it's allowing these two threads to be woven so closely together that for someone just reading that, the public, it's a free exhibit, you would think those two things are the same. The Christian message and what the Apostle Paul is doing, preaching the gospel, with the actions of European colonizers. And all I want to point out is how easy it is to tie these two threads together and tar something like Christianity with this awful reputation and change the public perception of something. And why I'm getting that is I'm pretty sure that's the kind of thing that Paul's opponents in this story must have been doing. Saying, look at what's happening in our towns. Look what's happened to our culture. Look what's going on in the families and the traditions. And it's all because of what this man is doing and what he's saying. And I would suggest, getting to the point, that Luke, who's writing this account, is trying his best to actively separate those threads from one another. Because Luke is writing, if you don't know this, if you have speedy fingers, you can go back to Luke chapter 1. Right at the start, 908, I think. So Luke is essentially writing one long story. It starts in the Gospel of Luke. It continues in the book of Acts. And he tells us right at the start, many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. Here we go. So it also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed. Now, people suspect, if you jump back to page 980, people suspect that what Luke is doing is he is writing Luke and Acts in order to provide a case for the Apostle Paul, who was in front of courts in Rome. He was under sort of house arrest, and people were making up their minds about this man. He has got such a reputation as being a plague on the nation, a destroyer of cultures, ruining traditions. And people are trying to make up their minds about him. And one who's possibly nicknamed Theophilus, Luke is writing for that case and saying, let me just pull apart these threads and clarify what has actually happened versus what the reputation says. So I think, I'm going on about this because I think this is one of Luke's major moments where he is trying to pull apart what's actually going on for clarity, but also I would say to build confidence. There are 2 empty chairs at the front if you're brave enough. He's pulling apart these threads for clarity's sake, but also to build confidence in future readers. And that's us. I know we're quite distracted at the moment, but let's stay with it. We need confidence as Christians. All of the preceding generations who were reading this needed confidence. They had this reputation about Christianity that had spread. It has been tarred with all sorts of negative ideas. And all of that has been woven together, and we need the confidence to say what's true and what's not, what's accurate. And I'd say we need that confidence more than ever at the moment. There's been a lot written recently in podcasts and other things about the Western Church over the last decade or so. The priority of the Western Church used to be evangelism. Going out, which means going out and telling people the gospel, people who haven't heard it before, through running alpha courses, through going out on the streets, through interactive with one another, through Christianity Explored. There's loads of different ways. And a major priority of churches was evangelism. But that has massively reduced in the last 10 years and been replaced by what some people call discipleship. Now, I would say discipleship without evangelism is just self-improvement. But this decrease in the importance of evangelism, I think, is connected to a few things in our society. If you think about it in the last decade, what has happened across society? There's been the Me Too movement. There's been the Black Lives Matter movement. There has been an increase in trans rights and conversations around that. There has been shifts in politics. Many people going to the left, others going to the right, and this sort of increase in talk about Christian nationalism and these kinds of things. There have been all sorts of societal issues going on. And I would suggest in nearly all of these conversations, at some point, the opponents of Christianity try to combine Christianity with the negatives of whatever these different things have been. So whatever it is, whatever has come through society, there has been this intermingling and essentially saying Christians are some of the most awful perpetrators of this or this or this. And critics of Christianity have woven those two threads together so much that I think people have massively lost confidence in evangelism. Because evangelism nowadays sounds like hate speech. It is given that idea, the connotations of trying to tell people that your beliefs are true and theirs aren't, or something like that. This is hate speech, this is damaging, this is destructive. And you can see from a free gallery in a museum to just various different stories out there in society at the moment, TV dramas, whatever it might be, people very easily interweave these two threads together. And I think Christians start to believe it and actually start to wonder, well, maybe we can't really talk about this in the public square because of all the reputational damage it's done and all the negative connotations that are there. And I think many are scared to talk about this in their workplaces, even families, because of all of that's been interwoven together. Like I say, Luke is trying to separate out these things to clarify what's true and what's just bad smear tactics from the enemy. I'd say we need confidence, and that's the aim of my talk today, if possible. We need confidence, but we don't need arrogance. My fear is there's a swing that as people, there's a resurgence in enthusiasm about Christianity, but that could easily swing into arrogance, putting people down, dismissing, insulting, becoming very vitriolic online, all sorts of videos being made to belittle others. Does the Apostle Paul do that? Does he insult? Does he nag? Does he get shrill or oppressive? At no point. Does he try to colonize them? If you read the next two chapters, the Apostle Paul makes the strongest argument to not force these people to change what they eat, change what they dress, change their festivals, or their cultural traditions. He actively argues in Jerusalem, we must not place the yoke of Judaism upon these people. So he is the opposite of trying to colonize, but he is going in with the confidence of something. And what is it? He believes a grand story that is genuinely good news for all people. What is that story? And the reason he's telling the story in this way is because he's in a very pagan region where people worship multiple different gods. The local gods, the national gods, the various gods that attach to the weather systems or the land or the city or the wealth. You get a god in every corner, a shrine in every home. And Paul is preaching to them and he tells this story on purpose. There is a single creator of all of this. Can I have the next slide, which is my mock-up of what it might have looked like. You can imagine him gesturing to everything, the fields, the trees, the birds overhead. Perhaps it was raining at the time. He's gesturing to it all. There is a God who created all this. One God, a creator of all things in heaven and on earth, which would have resonated in the conscience of many pagans because they had a sense there is a bigger God out there. But to make that God more tangible, they've got all their little ones. But he's saying there is a creator God, one single God who's made all of this. And that God didn't just create all of this and then distance himself from it and say, well, that was good, I've switched the lights on now, they can handle themselves. No, he says that God has sustained and provided every single minute of every day for you folk on this hilltop. Every single breakfast, lunch and dinner that you've ever had was provided by this God. Every breath you've ever taken was given to you by this God. He has sustained you and provided for you from the very beginning. And what have we done in response to that God? We've created our own gods. Various different things to suit our different preferences and ways of life. The comedian Ricky Gervais tries to use this as a slam against all religion when he, in interviews often, he says, well, there are 3,000 gods out there. Which one do you choose? Yeah, good point. If anything, he's reiterating the story here. We create gods. We're very good at it. In response, God created us, and in response, we created gods. That's the story Paul tells. But instead of this creator God, therefore, just switching the lights off and stopping the water until everyone cries out for mercy and help, it says, no, that God is so good, he has continued to bless you. Every single day, every drop of rain was a blessing and a gift from God, despite the fact that you were worshipping the rain god in the process. He's telling them the compassion and the love of the real creator God who made all things. And he's continued to show you patience and compassion and love. But Paul is saying, but now he has acted in the world in such a seismic way that it's sending ripple effects across the entire creation, and he is bringing all of creation back to himself. And that is why we are here. You can imagine him an arm round Barnabas at this point. That is why we have come. To call you back to the Creator who made all things, to call you away from these small gods that lead you away from him, to call you back to into a relationship with that Creator God. Now, you might be in the room, but just imagine it for the Christians here. If you were reading this with a friend who's sort of a modern secular skeptic, they would perhaps look at Paul and Barnabas here and say, how Western of them, how disrespectful, how intolerant of them to be doing these kinds of things. The people of Lystra have come out in their cultural dress. They are practicing their traditional religions in front of you, and you're being so dismissive and so disrespectful. You could turn to your friend and say, well, what should they have done? And your friend might say, well, what they should have done is been far more tolerant. They should have integrated their beliefs into their own. They should have recognized that all religions really are just our attempt to explain the same thing. And in the end, they're all the same. We don't need to differ over the differences. We should just find unity in the similarities. I know this script because this is the script that I grew up with. This is the script that I preached until my early 20s. And it's the most arrogant script available to mankind, I would suggest. Because what's it saying is, actually, we've decided how important everyone's beliefs are. Let us tell you, you don't need to worry about them because there's bigger things to worry about. We're trying to fix humanity and you're fighting over your beliefs in gods. When you realize that those things are less important than what we're all trying to do together, then we can make progress. That is the script that I grew up in. It's the water I swam in as a kid and growing up in society. I think it's still very prevalent in our society today. But it is the most arrogant script available. It's to say, look, all of your beliefs are essentially irrelevant. We've decided that there is no big God in heaven that is relevant to any of us really. So you can create your own gods as long as you don't disrupt our peace and our harmony that we've worked hard to get and to achieve. I say it sounds innocent until you realize how arrogant it really is. It comes often out of the mouths of people like me when I was growing up who would say, I'm not religious, brackets, like you are, brackets, because I don't need to be like you do. Friends, it's far more colonial having that attitude than what the Apostle Paul is doing. The Apostle Paul is not belittling their gods and saying, look, all of this is irrelevant and unimportant, and look, can we just chat and tolerate one another and these kinds of things? He doesn't belittle their gods. He takes them very seriously. He says you have to turn from these things because they're leading you in all sorts of wrong directions. He says so clearly and so powerfully, look, you need to turn from all of this, not because it's irrelevant, because it's taking you away from the loving Creator God who has sent his own Son into this world and wants all people to recognize that and to return to him and experience life. Paul sincerely believes, because of Jesus and the Scriptures, that these gods that we create in our own image, and then we follow and we devote our lives to them, are seriously bad news in comparison to the good news that he's preaching. That there is a God who loves us, and instead of switching off the lights and turning off the water and just judging all of us for creating our own gods, has sent his own Son into the world to bring all people back to himself. Paul does not want them to end their existence holding on to a hollow, fruitless deity when they could return and be reunited with their loving Creator. That's the message. He goes into this town of absolute pagans and says, I can see how you are so devoted to these things, but eventually they lead you into worthlessness and uselessness and fruitlessness. They take you nowhere. But there is a Creator God who wants you back. Now, what's your judgment on Paul at this point? Was he brave or was he stupid? He had every reason to turn back at this point. He's been to Antioch in Pisidia, preached. It went well one week. Next week went terribly. They escape. They go to Iconium. Again, have really hostile reception from the locals. By this point, surely you would justify going, actually, I'll go back to my hometown, I'll go back to the original Antioch in Jerusalem and let them know how it's gone. Surely they wouldn't see me as a failure if I went and did that. He could absolutely justify this rather than going up into those hilltops. It's likely that Paul had some kind of illness at this point, and we'll discuss that at a later date. But you could imagine him justifying completely, well, actually, this would be the moment to go back. But he doesn't. He could have easily seen that lame man on the street and felt like maybe I should pray for him, but actually say, I'll pray when I get home so I don't cause any upset. I don't maybe cause embarrassment if it doesn't work. I'll pray for him when I get back to my hotel room and hope that all goes well for him. He could have done that. No one would have known. He could have acted flattered by their sacrifices when they bring those massive bulls up. He could have said, well, it's a little bit similar to Judaism. I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to upset. I don't want to disrupt. I don't want to cause an issue. But he doesn't. I would suggest it's because of the story that Paul believes that there is a loving, compassionate Creator, Father, Son, and Spirit, who has created this world, sustained it for every second of the day, and gives and gives and gives to the point that he gave his only Son. And his only Son gave up his own life to bring all people back to himself, to forgive them of their sins. Because he believes that story, Paul is doing the brave thing. What he's doing is not stupid, it's not disrespectful, it's not culturally inappropriate, it is brave. And as I've been mulling over this, and it's very easy to say this from a stage in some sort of bravado, but I've been asking myself this question, am I being brave or am I being stupid at the moment in life? Because I believe the same story that Paul believed, and I certainly don't step out in faith or expectation in the same way that he did. Sometimes I have to give myself the verdict. I'm being stupid. I'm not living in line with the story that I claim to believe. What about you? Paul was brave in real life. I see lots of bravery online, reposting certain videos, commenting on things, signing certain petitions. Now, there's a place for all those things, but if that's the extent of our bravery, it's not very brave. He was brave in real life. Let me give you a couple of examples of what being brave in real life might be. What about going for drinks with your colleagues, knowing that there's a high likelihood that the topic might turn to you and church and Christianity? How about getting to know the neighbours that you've sort of seen occasionally around you, but never really stepped out to say hi to, even the really unusual ones that live upstairs, that might actually have all sorts of opinions that rub you up the wrong way? What about saying yes to going to your friend's party? They're a Muslim, you know that, and you know that actually culturally it'll feel very, very different for you to go into that kind of environment. What about saying yes to the friends reunion in the summer of all the friends you've known from university, despite knowing there's a very high likelihood of a big conversation about sexuality at something like that? How about inviting someone to a local alpha that's happening near you right now? We're not running an alpha here at the moment, but we have a website called interested.london, which links you to all the various ways that churches brilliantly are putting on alpha courses, Christianity Explored courses, lunchtime talks in the city. How about looking at that and saying, actually, there might be a colleague or a friend who would be interested, who I could text. Sian, my wife, tried. She asked one of our friends who looks after kids at the school and asked, would you like to go to the alpha that's happening at the church at the end of our road? She said no, for now. But I'd say that's bravery in real life. And can we try to learn from Luke's example, or Paul's example, learn from how Luke is writing this? Look, let's separate these threads apart. Let's not live cowering under this terrible reputation that's been given to the Christian faith. Actually separate them out. Don't live like a colonizer. Don't be more interested in trying to change people's behavior, their eating habits and everything to make them feel nicer to you. But actually, can we be confident in the gospel, the message that has changed this world and continues to do so? We want to fill London with followers of Jesus as a church. We're never going to do that without bravery. Otherwise, all of the opportunities will pass us by. And I think the thing is this, the brave thing is believing that Jesus actually will be there where you are, when you're having that conversation, when you're trying to pray for someone, when you're inviting them, whatever it is. Jesus, he was in Lystra. Like, we know about it now, but no one knew about it then. It's a tiny little hill town, and there's this small lame man sitting on the side of the road who's nobody to nobody. And yet Jesus was just right next to him as he was the apostles and everyone else. Jesus is as present in your situations as well. We need to believe that. We can be brave because Jesus is with us where we go into this city this week. And I'd say this, we're with you as well. Now that might mean less than Jesus is with me, but we're with you. If you're in a life group, I find life groups incredibly helpful ways to feel reinforced in my faith when it went terribly that week. When all of my attempts to share or do something, or I'm feeling really like I'm lacking in any kind of bravery at all, but a little story from someone in my life group spurs me on again. Jesus is with us, we are with you. So church, let's be brave and be bold and know that Christ is with us. And I'd love us to take the meal that he gives to his church, to strengthen his church and to fill us with new bravery again, that the story is true And the end is already written, that Jesus will be victorious over all of these powers that we've created. And goodness will prevail, and righteousness will prevail in the end. This story reminds us that what Jesus did at the cross has eternal significance. It means that we are washed from our sins. We are cleansed forever, simply by faith. But it also means that Jesus has broken into this world and changed everything for the good. He rose again 3 days later, and he says, I'm going to eat this again with you at the end, when I return. Jesus will make all things new eventually. And everyone will realize that this story that Paul was telling was the true story in the end. And we get to be part of that. So let's take communion together. Let's do it, family. Just pray for one another for bravery and boldness in the week ahead. And then we'll start worshiping again.